Graf was on the engine cover when the order came through. He was still holding the dipstick when I told him to put it back, close it up, and get his kit onto the vehicle. He looked at the dipstick, looked at me, and did what he was told. The order had come down the previous evening, and none of us had slept well after it. We were going east, not south. Not the Caucasus, not the route we had been preparing for since July, not the direction every man in the division had quietly assumed for the past 2 weeks, based on the maps and the briefings and the way the supply trains had been organized. East, toward a place called Kotelnikovo, and beyond that toward something none of the section had yet named out loud. Hartung had said nothing when I told the section. He was the oldest of them by 4 years, an Obergefreiter from Erfurt who had been in the division since before Barbarossa and who processed information by going very still and very quiet for several minutes before he said anything at all. He went still. Dawn asked a question about the Caucasus, whether we were still going there eventually, whether this was temporary, and I told him I did not know, which was the truth, and he nodded and went back to checking his ammunition. The column formed up in the grey before sunrise. Half-tracks and trucks and motorcycles with sidecars, the dust already rising from the track before the first vehicles had cleared the assembly area. The steppe stretched east in every direction, flat and pale and enormous, the horizon a thin, dark line against a sky that was lightening from black to grey to the particular washed-out white that meant another day of serious heat. No hills, no trees, no feature of any kind to break the distance. Just the grass and the dust and the column moving into it. I had been in this country for 3 weeks, long enough to stop being surprised by the scale of it and start being worn down by it instead. The steppe did something to a man's sense of proportion. It reduced everything, made every human object look small and provisional, made the distances between things feel wrong in a way you could not quite identify until you realized it was because there was nothing to measure distance against. No church towers, no tree lines, no rooftops on the horizon, just the flat earth running to the edge of the sky in every direction, and the column threading through it like something very small, trying to cross something very large. The Kalmyk steppe was worse than what we had crossed before. Whatever the Don Bend had been, and it had been bad enough, this was different. The grass here was lower, drier, the color of old bone. The soil beneath it cracked and grey, fine enough to turn to powder under the tracks and rise in columns that the morning air held suspended long after the vehicles had passed. The heat came earlier here and hit harder. By 8 in the morning, it was already the kind of heat that made the air above the ground ripple and move and made distant objects uncertain, their edges soft and shifting, as if the steppe was slowly dissolving everything it contained. Zeitz, the sanitator attached to our platoon, had spent the first hour of the march reorganizing his kit bag. He did this at the beginning of every movement, working through the contents systematically, checking what was there against what he had written in his notebook. I had watched him do it enough times to know it was not anxiety, it was method. He knew exactly what was in the bag. The checking was about something else, about being ready, but making the hands do something purposeful while the mind adjusted to whatever was coming. We had been moving for perhaps 2 hours when Hartung, sitting at the front right of the half-track with his rifle across his knees, raised one hand. The column slowed. I was on my feet before the vehicle stopped, my eyes already moving to where Hartung was looking, northeast, toward a low line of scrub brush and dry grass that ran along what might have been a shallow drainage channel, barely visible, barely a feature at all in the flat country. Something was moving in it, not wind. The air had been dead since dawn. This was a different kind of movement, the kind that has direction, that comes from one point and goes to another, that is caused by something with intention rather than weather. The grass bent in a line, parallel to the channel. Moving south toward the track, I told the section to dismount. They were over the side of the half-track in 4 seconds. Gref caught his boot on the track guard and stumbled, and Hartung caught his arm without looking at him and without saying anything. Dawn was already prone in the grass to the right, his rifle up, his face in the dirt. I dropped behind the front wheel of the half-track and watched the channel. The first figure appeared at the edge of the scrub, 40 meters out. A Soviet soldier, on his feet, moving fast, not watching us, watching something behind him, back the way he had come, back up the channel to the north. His uniform was wrong. Torn, dirty, missing the cap, and underneath the dirt something dark that had soaked through the fabric on his left side and dried there. He came out of the scrub at a stumble, and then stopped when he saw the column and stood absolutely still, the way an animal stands still when it realizes it has miscalculated. More movement in the channel behind him. I counted 4, 5, 6 figures coming out of the scrub in ones and twos. Some armed, most not. One man helped another who was not walking well. These were not soldiers in any formation I recognized. They were the remnants of something that had already been broken. Men who had been in a worse place than this one and were moving away from it by instinct, without orders, without a direction except away. The Luftwaffe had been here this morning. We had heard it. The sound of the Junkers working over the railway line to the northeast. The percussion of it coming to us across the flat ground without diminishing. The way sound travels in country with nothing to stop it. These men had been in the trains. The first soldier was still standing at the edge of the scrub. He looked at the half-track. He looked at me behind the wheel. He made no move toward his weapon, which was still slung across his back. Then Gref fired. The shot went over the man's head by what I estimated was less than a meter, and the man dropped immediately, flat into the grass, and the others scattered back into the scrub. I told Gref to cease fire, and he did. I told Dawn to watch the right flank, because there was more movement there now, more figures coming out of the grass further east, and Dawn swung his rifle without question. What followed was not a battle. It was a process, and it lasted perhaps 12 minutes, and it was the kind of thing you do when the situation is confused and the enemy is already broken, and the task is to resolve it without losing men to it. There were 23 of them in the end, dispersed along 300 meters of the channel, and most of them came out when we moved the half-track off the track and into the grass and showed them they were surrounded, which they already knew. 3 of them did not come out. We did not find them. The ones we took were from the 208th Rifle Division. We did not know the unit designation at the time. That came from a document one of the platoon's Feldwebels found on an officer among the prisoners, a half-burned regimental order with a unit stamp that was still readable. What we could see without documents was the state of them. Men who had been on trains that no longer existed, who had come through a Luftwaffe strike in open country, who had been walking south for hours with their wounded and their confusion, and who had run into us because the steppe offered nowhere else to go. Seitz went to work on 3 of them who needed immediate attention. He moved efficiently and without visible reaction to what he was dealing with, which I had come to understand was not indifference, but a form of discipline. He noted things in his notebook between patients. He used what he had and did not ask for what he did not have. The column had backed up behind us. I could see the vehicle commanders of the trucks further back standing on their running boards, looking forward, trying to understand the delay. The motorcycles at the rear had stopped. Somewhere behind them, the main armor of the regiment was waiting. I handed the prisoners to the company's rear element and got the section back on the half-track. Gref was quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet, tighter, focused inward. He had fired without order, and he knew it, and he was not going to say anything about it, and neither was I. Not here, not now. Hartung looked at me once. I looked back. That was the conversation. The column started moving again. We drove east into the dust and the heat and the steppe that had no end to it, and somewhere ahead of us, still several hours away across that flat, enormous country, The railway station at Kotelnikovo was burning. The smoke had been on the horizon for the last hour of the approach. A dark column rising straight up in the windless air, the kind of column that does not come from a field fire or a farmhouse, but from something larger, something with metal in it, something that burns hot and long and does not go out when the fuel runs low, because there is always more fuel. By the time we could see the station buildings, or what remained of them, the smoke had spread into a low ceiling that cut off the upper half of the sky and turned the light underneath it a flat, dirty orange that made everything look wrong. The grass, the wrong color, the buildings, the wrong color, the faces of the men around me, the wrong color. The Luftwaffe had been here at first light. 4 troop trains, we were told later. 4 complete trains carrying elements of the 208th Rifle Division brought up by rail from the rear areas in the Stavka's scramble to plug the gap that the 4th Panzer Army had torn open when it turned east. They had arrived at Kotelnikovo station in the grey before sunrise, and they had still been unloading when the Junkers found them. That was what we were told. What we could see coming into the station area from the west along the railway embankment was consistent with it. 3 carriages on the main line, 2 of them still burning with a low, serious fire that the heat of the day was doing nothing to discourage. The 4th, further up the line, derailed, lying on its side at an angle that suggested the track beneath it had been hit rather than the carriage itself. The platform structures, wooden, low, provincial in the way of every small station in this part of Russia, had caught from the carriages and burned faster and were now mostly gone, the posts still standing, black and skeletal, the roofing collapsed between them. Equipment scattered across the platform and into the grass on both sides. Ammunition crates, some open and empty, some intact. A field kitchen overturned, medical supplies in boxes that had been dragged clear of the fire by someone and then abandoned. Rifles, loose rounds, webbing, the detritus of a unit that had been a unit 2 hours ago and was not one anymore. The men who had been in those trains were the ones we had been encountering since before Kotelnikovo. The groups moving south through the scrub, the individuals in the grass, the wounded who could not move and who we had found sitting beside the railway line, waiting with the particular patience of men who had stopped making decisions and were waiting for someone else to make them. The survivors of the strike had scattered in every direction. Some had gone north, some south. Some were still in the station area when we arrived, not fighting, not running, just present in the way of men who had nowhere else to go and no strength left to go there. Not all of them were like that. The 14th Panzer had gone in first, their vehicles pushing through the station area from the south while we were still 2 kilometers out. By the time our column reached the station perimeter, the armored vehicles of the lead regiment were already past the platform and pushing north up the railway line, and the sound of their guns carried back to us clearly over the flat ground. We could see the dust of their passage and the occasional bright flash of a main gun firing and the darker, longer smoke of something burning that was not a train. Hauptmann Wolf, our company commander, a compact man from Jena who communicated primarily through a series of gestures that every man in the company had spent 3 months learning to read, came down the column on foot, moving at pace, and said something to each vehicle crew as he passed. When he reached our half-track, he pointed at the station buildings to the northeast and held up 4 fingers and said something about the goods warehouse, about what was reported to be inside it. What was reported to be inside it was Soviet infantry, not survivors from the trains. These were formed troops who had arrived before the Luftwaffe strike and had dug in, or at least taken position, in the substantial brick structure of the warehouse that sat 40 meters back from the main platform. Whether they had been part of the 208th or a separate security element or something else entirely, we did not know. What we knew was what Wolf had said with 4 fingers. 4 sections, approximately, based on the fire volume that the company's lead platoon had drawn when it approached from the south. Wolf moved on to the next vehicle. I told the section what we were doing. Hartung was already checking his ammunition. Dawn asked how far. I pointed. He looked at the warehouse, squat, substantial, its small windows dark, and nodded and said nothing else. Gref had his stick grenades out of the stowage bag and was distributing them without being asked, 2 each, working down the vehicle. His hands were steady. Whatever had been working in him since the incident on the march had resolved itself into something useful. We dismounted 200 meters from the warehouse. The approach was along the back of the station buildings, what remained of them, using the standing walls as cover where the walls still stood and moving fast across the gaps where they did not. The fire in the carriages to our left was loud, in a way I had not anticipated. Not explosive, but constant, a steady roar with irregular punctuation when something inside a carriage gave way or a pocket of fuel or ammunition cooked off. Each of those moments sending a pressure through the air that you felt in the chest before you heard it. The smoke moved over us in layers, low and thick and tasting of things that had no business being breathed. Sights was with us. He stayed close to the last man in the file, which was his position, far enough back to be away from the immediate contact, close enough to reach anyone who went down. I could see him in my peripheral vision when we stopped at each wall gap. His kit bag tight against his body, his face set in the particular expression he had during movement. Not afraid, not calm, simply suspended, all non-essential processing shut down until the situation required him. The first contact at the warehouse came from the left, from a window on the building's western face that looked back toward the platform and that we had been unable to see from our approach angle. A rifle shot, then immediately 3 more in a burst, and then Hartung was grabbing Dawn by the collar and pulling him flat, and the rounds were going into the wall above where Dawn had been standing. Dawn hit the ground and stayed there. The window was 30 meters away and the angle was bad. I told Hartung to put fire on the window. He moved to the corner of the wall we were behind and put his rifle around it without exposing himself and began firing at the window frame in a controlled rhythm, not trying to hit anyone, trying to keep their head down. The sound of it in the enclosed space between the walls was enormous. Gref was already moving. He had gone right without instruction, using the back wall of the next building as cover, working toward an angle on the window that Hartung could not get from where he was. I watched him go. He moved well, low, fast, deliberate, using every piece of cover the ruined station offered without hesitating at transitions between covered and uncovered ground. He had done this before. Not with us, not in this campaign, but somewhere. The movement was too practiced to be new. He reached a broken section of platform wall and went flat behind it and brought his rifle up. From there, he could see into the window at an oblique angle. He fired once, and the rifle fire from the window stopped. Stopped completely. Not suppressed. Stopped. We held the position for 30 seconds, no further fire from the window. Hartung looked at me. I looked at the window. I gave the hand signal to move, and we moved. The warehouse door was on the northern face, a wide wooden sliding door, the kind designed for loading freight, partially open, the gap about 1 meter wide. Inside, dark. The daylight from the windows cutting across the interior in flat orange bars through the smoke haze. The smell of the burning trains penetrated even here, mixed with the interior smell of dust and old timber and something chemical that I could not identify and did not try to. There were 11 of them inside. They had been in a formed position, 2 men at each window, 1 at the door gap, but the formation had broken down. 2 were dead, 1 of them by the western window where Gref had fired. 3 more were wounded to varying degrees, sitting against the interior wall with the particular stillness of men who have decided that the fight has moved past them. The remaining 6 were on their feet with their weapons, and the decision about what to do with those weapons was made in the first second after we came through the door, in the way those decisions are always made, by whoever moved fastest and by whoever did not. It was over in less than 2 minutes, and I will not account for every second of it. What I will say is that Dawn came through the door last and stood inside it and looked at what the room contained, and then looked at the floor and breathed carefully for a moment. He was 19 years old. He had been with us since May. I had watched him in the channel earlier in the day, prone in the grass with his rifle up, steady. I watched him now and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He looked up. He was steady again. The moment had passed through him, the way those moments do, leaving something behind, not nothing, but not enough to stop him. Sights came through the door and went straight to the wounded. He moved between them without hesitating, making quick assessments, noting things. One of the 3 would need more than he could do here. He said this to me directly, without drama, said what the situation was, said what it required, left the decision to me. I told him to do what he could. He nodded and did it. Outside, the station area continued its gradual reduction. The 14th Panzer's guns were still audible to the north, still working through whatever they had found up the railway line. Other sections from our company were in the station buildings to the south and west, and the sound of their work came to us intermittently through the smoke and the roar of the burning carriages. A runner came from Wolf with a message about the next objective, something about a signal building, about a position north of the station, about timing. I acknowledged it and passed it to Hartung for the section's awareness. Greff was sitting on a freight crate inside the warehouse. He was checking his rifle, not methodically, not for any particular reason, just doing something with his hands while the rest of him processed the last 40 minutes. He had not spoken since we entered the building. I sat beside him for a moment, not to say anything, just to be in the same space for a moment, which sometimes is what is needed and sometimes is all that is available. He looked up. He said something about the man in the channel, the first man, the one he had fired at without order on the march. Said it quietly, factually, the way men speak when they are not asking for absolution, but are not yet ready to put something away completely. I said something back, brief, to the point. He nodded. He put the rifle down across his knees and looked at the warehouse wall. Outside, the trains burned, the smoke column that had guided us here since before Kotelnikovo was still rising, still perfectly vertical in the windless afternoon air. The 14th Panzer was still moving north. Somewhere above the smoke ceiling, the sky was the same white it had been since morning, indifferent to what was happening below it in the dust and the fire and the broken platform of a small station on the Kalmyk steppe in the first week of August 1942. We had objectives ahead. The Aksai River was to the north, still hours away across that flat country. The day was not close to finished. I told the section to stand up. They stood. If you'd like to continue watching this testimony in full, along with access to many more complete stories and documentaries, you can join us on Patreon through the link in the description. There, you'll find full-length exclusive videos and documentaries not available here on YouTube. If you prefer to listen instead, the complete audiobook version of this testimony, uninterrupted and without ads, is also available through the link below. And of course, both are direct ways to support our work since this channel isn't monetized. You'll find everything in the description. We left Kotelnikovo at midday. The column reformed on the northern edge of the station area, half-tracks and trucks falling into the march order that had been established before first light, each vehicle finding its position in the sequence without instruction, because there had been enough of these departures that the sequence had become automatic. Wolf came past on foot one last time, checking vehicle spacing, saying something to each commander. When he reached us, he looked at the section, looked at each man, not quickly, not a glance, but a real assessment, the way he always did after a contact. And then he looked at me and nodded once and moved on. That was the debrief. That was all the debrief there was going to be. The track north from Kotelnikovo was not a road. It was a compression in the steppe, a line where vehicles had gone before and had pressed the dry grass flat and the soil beneath it hard. In places it widened, where something heavy had gone off the track and then returned to it. In places it narrowed to barely the width of a single vehicle. The dust it produced was extraordinary, a fine grey-white powder that rose from the tracks as soon as the first vehicles moved over it, and that the column's passage turned into a continuous wall of suspended particles that moved at the column's pace and enveloped every vehicle in it and settled on every surface and entered every opening. After 20 minutes of it, the men wore the dust. It was on their faces and in their hair, and on the fabric of their uniforms, and in their mouths and in their eyes, which they kept half closed against it, and in their noses, which did no good because the dust was fine enough to go past whatever the body put in its way. Dawn tied his neckcloth around his face below the eyes. It helped somewhat. He offered it to Gref as a demonstration, and Gref did the same with his own cloth. Hartung had been doing it since the second day in this country and watched the younger men figure it out with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite contempt, but something located between the two. The heat by early afternoon was the worst I had encountered since the campaign began. I had a thermometer in my kit, a small instrument that had no tactical purpose and that I had carried since training, and that told me, when I checked it at what I estimated was 2 in the afternoon, that the air temperature was 42 degrees. That was in the shade of the half-track's armor plating. In the open, standing on the track in the direct sun, it would have been more. The sun in this part of Russia in August was not the sun of Germany or France or even of the Ukraine. It was a different thing entirely, lower and larger and more persistent, sitting in the sky without mercy and pressing down on everything beneath it. The metal of the half-track was untouchable with bare skin. The rifle barrels burned through gloves. The water in the canteens was warm before 9 in the morning, and by afternoon was the temperature of the tea they served at the field kitchens, which was a temperature at which water kept a man alive but did nothing else for him. Sights checked the water situation at each stop. There were 4 stops in the first 3 hours of the march north, twice for vehicle maintenance, once for a routing delay at a place where the track divided and someone ahead of us had made the wrong choice, once for reasons that were never communicated to our level, but that produced a 20-minute halt in which everyone sat in what shade the vehicles offered and drank as little as they could manage. At each stop, Sights went down the section asking about consumption, asking about symptoms, writing things in his notebook. At the 3rd stop, he said something to me about Dawn, said it quietly between the two of us. That Dawn was not drinking enough, and that in this heat that would become a problem faster than Dawn likely understood. I told Dawn to drink. He drank. He looked at the canteen afterward in a way that meant he was calculating how much was left and how far we had to go, and the calculation was not producing a comfortable result. The half-track's cooling system gave out at the 2nd stop. The mechanics had been watching it since Kotelnikovo. The temperature gauge had been climbing since we left the station area, moving in a slow arc that everyone on the vehicle had been monitoring without discussing. When it reached the top of its range and stayed there, the driver, a Gefreiter named Baum, who had been with the vehicle longer than any of us, and who regarded its mechanical condition as a personal matter, stopped, dismounted, opened the engine cover, and looked at what was inside with an expression of concentrated professional disapproval. He said something about a hose, about the same hose the mechanics had looked at twice before without resolving. about what he needed to fix it properly and what he had available to fix it now, which were two different lists with no overlap. He fixed it with what he had available. It took 25 minutes and involved a section of rubber tubing from the medical kit that Seitz watched being removed from his supplies with visible restraint. The repair was not good. Baum said this himself, said it was not good, said it would hold for some hours, said the hose needed replacement before the next full day's movement. He said all of this in a flat, technical voice, the way he said everything, and then he got back behind the controls and the column moved. The Kalmyk steppe through the afternoon was the same in every direction and continued to be the same for as far as any of us could see, which was a very long way. No villages, no structures of any kind. No animals, no birds, nothing living that was visible. The grass had dried past pale into something almost white, brittle enough that the vehicle's passage crushed it to powder rather than bending it flat. The soil beneath, where the tracks had exposed it, was grey and cracked in polygonal patterns, each polygon curled slightly at its edges, as if trying to peel away from the ground beneath it. In the worst places, the track crossed ground that had no grass at all, just the cracked grey earth running to the horizon, featureless, the surface of a country that had given up on supporting anything. Hartung sat at the front right of the half-track through the afternoon march and looked at the steppe with the specific expression he had for landscapes that required processing. Not engaged, not disengaged, present in a reduced way, taking in what was necessary and setting aside what was not. I'd been watching him long enough to know that this was not indifference. He was thinking about something. He would say what it was when he was ready, and not before. It was the middle of the afternoon when he said it. He said something about the Caucasus, about what they had told us in the briefings, the mountains, the passes, the specific kind of terrain that the division had been preparing for since July. About the fact that he had, in the way of a soldier, with some experience and some ability to read logistical patterns, understood from the supply train and the equipment issued and the nature of the training that the Caucasus was where they were going. He had understood this and made his adjustments and was prepared for it. He said this without bitterness, as an observation about the difference between what you prepare for and what arrives. I said something brief. He nodded and looked back at the steppe. The attack came without warning at 3:30. We were crossing a section of ground that was, if anything, even flatter and more featureless than the average, the track running absolutely straight for as far as you could see ahead. The half-track in front of us was 30 meters ahead, and I could see the vehicle behind it, and behind that, the dust and heat shimmer that swallowed the rest of the column.